Did I put up a batch at the last minute?
Today?
No, 2 days ago. You didn't see them.
A batch, right?
I put about 3 or 4 questions about.
I got one of your questions.
Well, I mean, it was all one.
Yeah, I answered. Didn't you see the answer?
I haven't been home to my email, so I don't know if I answered them.
Oh, okay. Well, I did.
Everybody knows the answer.
Everybody knows the answer except you, Chuck. But some of what you asked.
I know the answer to some of it already.
Well, and also it's relevant, so the topics will come up again. But you had a question?
Well, I have 1 or 2 specific kind of language questions.
Okay.
And also a request. It would be helpful for me, I think, before we leave into Kant, and it might be helpful for others, to follow your the text and retrace a little bit some of your thoughts, kind of a summary of Aristotle, Aquinas, and
do a kind of little review, you mean, leading up?
Review the way you do it almost in a chapter before you actually get to the new thinker. Just because the dialogue is becoming more and more obvious, in the text between the past, and we're covering now. So that just is a request.
The request is that I give a kind of a general summary leading up to Kant. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
That would be helpful to me.
Okay.
And then I do have some specific language questions once we get into Kant.
Okay. You want to hold those? Yeah.
So I have a comment that I'm going to make in order to try to be helpful to the various meditators and mystics who are sitting here and the person who's doomed to try to teach them. Basically, I had the fortune this past week to have conversations with Todd and Valtraud and Chuck, which sort of culminated in a conversation with Valtraud the last 15 minutes, which was very, very useful to me. Which is the whole history of my reading philosophy at the same time as doing these various meditation practices and mystical adventures. There's always been this enormous tension between those two things, which eventually got sorted out to my satisfaction within myself. This work presents a new challenge about that, has presented a new challenge about that. And the specific thing that I came to in the last week as a result of these classes and a closer and more supported reading is that I saw in my own thinking how my thinking about thinking was thinking about reified thoughts, solidified thoughts. And my thinking about thinking was that Aristotle and Hegel and all those guys were thinking those kinds of thoughts. So the gap that has, even though it's not really a gap in my own understanding exactly, well, in my theoretical understanding, it's partly a gap in my personal capacity, and definitely a gap in the language of a lot of meditative and mystical kinds of things, which is a tremendous emphasis on the difference between thought and something that is unconditioned mind, consciousness, space. And tremendous emphasis on that, both in terms of thinking and for many people in terms of actual experience. So, I've been working with this for a long time, and Chuck and I have been asking this question from 1,000 different angles. What I came to in the last week is really at a new level, seeing the actual light of consciousness that it is these people thinking, so to speak, or is thinking in through as these actual people. So the experience changed from thinking their thoughts as structures to actually noticing the natural light of reason, as we speak in one sense of that. So something has started to illuminate from the inside for me. So that's all a thank you, and also just for my friends who were thinking in different ways. It really helped me to see a gap in my own understanding that's really resolving, and who knows where else it'll go.
Mhm.
I just wanted to say that for all the people that I communicate with, and thanks to my friends for the conversations, because it was really a tremendous opening to really to reduce that gap even more. And of course, that whole epistemological question is a huge thing. And it's just come to a new place for me already, which is great. So I hope that's useful to somebody.
It's useful to me because I can relate to it in terms of what we'll be saying about Hegel and Hegel's criticism of Kant and so forth. So it's quite useful both personally and project-wise.
Okay.
Were there any? So I'm going to come back to that in the right context. Yeah.
The question that I had relates to the question that Chuck put on the internet about the passivity of
Reason.
Right.
Modern.
No, he didn't put it in terms of modern really. It was a question of Aristotle versus. No, it was Descartes. Was it?
I stupidly didn't put the page numbers on.
Yeah,
they were inside of one of those kind of passages of comparison.
Yeah.
But,
you're right. Yeah.
But so the question for me was because you specifically speak about modern thought, as you were talking about Kant being passive, and so I was wondering whether your answer applied to that as well.
Yes.
Okay.
No, it applies. Is the question is that my answer to Chuck apply to Kant? Yes, and Descartes too.
Okay.
Beginning really with Descartes. So yes, I'm saying that modern thought relative to Aristotle is passive, and Chuck's question was, what does that mean, or how, or why do you say that, or how do we understand that?
The word passive gone.
And since we've gotten into that a little bit, for the sake of other people, let me just say that the essential idea, which is in the text, of which I kind of summarized for Chuck, the thought being, the way I'm using the terminology is that Aristotle's thinking, well, let's put it this way. You could say the analogy would be that subjectivity is to objectivity as passivity is to activity, and that relatively speaking, Aristotle is an objective and active thinker. Beginning with the moderns, using Descartes as our takeoff point, there is a relative, it increases, as we'll see in Hegel, he absolutizes it, okay? But they're already in Descartes, in his doubt, it goes back to a question, something I said, one of the first classes that Alia right away picked up on when I said that Descartes reconstructs the world, and she said, well, what do you mean reconstructs? And I ineptly tried to explain what I meant by reconstruct, but in a certain sense, use his own consciousness as the foundation, along with the innate idea of God that he has in that consciousness. They become that foundation of the undoubtability of his own being, coupled with the innate idea of God in that thinking thing that he is, with or without a body, essentially without a body. Those things, that subjectivity and its innate idea of God, which, by the way, is just it's the infinite picture of itself, right? Because it's the flip side of being created in the image of the artificer. That becomes the basis for reconstructing, for Descartes, on behalf of modern science, reconstructing his understanding of the world. So he doesn't take the world. The whole point of the methodological doubt is to call into question the naive, immediate, undoubting acceptance of our natural experience, of our experience of nature and of the world and even of our bodies. That's how intimately radical the doubt is, right? Or how radically intimate the doubt is. So, when I say that this is passive, I mean that in principle, beginning with Descartes, and more so as we go along, the passivity is that unless I can somehow or other relate my experience to me, I don't mean this in a personalistic sense, ego sense, right, to the I, then it's pushed out of bounds by Kant. That is the substance, and I'm only dealing with that which conforms to the structure of my consciousness, qua human reason, right? I'm saying that's passive in the sense that, in principle, there's no tolerance for the otherness, or the, in this sense of the word, the objectivity of the object. That is, its reality. I'm not dealing with its reality, except when we get to Kant, radically, insofar as its reality appears in my terms, so I can put it in a pedestrian way. Right? So modernity will only accept the world, so to speak, on its terms. And so in the answer, which you haven't read yet, I make some final allusion to Kant's idea, central idea for Kant, of the autonomy of reason. Now that has obviously for Kant a principally moral meaning, okay, but the scientific analogy is there. In other words, he subordinates his science, as I think is clear in the text, he subordinates the theoretical reason to the practical reason, right? And in that sense, he's very Cartesian, and in that sense, he's very, right, because the practical reason is the moral reason, it's as opposed to the theoretical reason in traditional Greek terms. So for Aristotle, the objectivity of the world, the world was real, independent of Aristotle's mind, or put it another way, for Aristotle, and earlier on in the Aristotle chapter, I guess I quote Aristotle quoting Protagoras, the famous sophist who said man is the measure of all things, and Aristotle says, well, if he meant, which of course he didn't, by the way, right? It's a kind of giving and taking away at the same breath, right? He says, if Protagoras meant that the man of science who has studied closely for many years his subject matter, the world, let's say, right, whatever it is, if he meant that a man who has studied the world, mind, having been impressed by what he observed, that mind is now the measure, right? Oh, if that's what he meant, of course, but then there was no point in saying it, says Aristotle. See? Okay? Yeah, so in other words, let's go slow that film down a little bit. In other words, what Aristotle understands is that human knowing, now we're going to just bracket the more complicated question of the divine element, all right? But human science, even qua human, for Aristotle, is the mind looking at the world, observing the world, and it's like it's almost like a film idea. Right? It'd be interesting. What he really understands is that the mind is taking a picture of the reality, and therefore the mind is being impressed. You could say quite literally impressed, but by analogy, but a kind of a literal analogy. The mind bears the imprint of the world. So what comes first there? In other words, the reality of the object impresses the mind. Now, if the mind is the measure of the world, yeah, it is, only because it studied the world. You see that in that sense? So I'm saying it's a semantic thing, but I think it's more than semantic. I'm saying that therefore, although it's ironic and it's somewhat paradoxical, that you could say, well, the mind, the Aristotelian mind, is passive in the sense that it receives the imprint of reality, you see? But I'm saying, yes, in one sense it's passive, but it's active in the sense that it is not necessary to Aristotle's understanding of human being, of rational being. It's not necessary to that Aristotelian understanding that there is no object unless it conforms to some independently pre-established human consciousness. You see? And in that sense, I'm saying Aristotle's not passive. Okay. And then you could flip that around the other way around. That's why I say you really should never get hung up on words exactly. I mean, words are necessary.
The confusion with Kant was the synthetic. The synthesis.
Well, I was just going to say. So the inverse paradox to Aristotle is that the modern mind is in a certain way understands itself to be synthesizing and constructing and forming and so forth and so on. And yet, of course, it also understands itself in some very important way, depending on the thinker, to be doing so in a kind of now here's the other level of comparison with Aristotle. Qua reason, to be doing it self-sufficiently. That's the key thing. That's the key shift, right? We say in Aristotle, there is a self-sufficiency, but the self-sufficiency is somewhat transcendent, even if with difficultly, it's terrible, you have to make up your own language, transcendent to reason, you see? So reason depends upon the divine core, which it isn't quite, but without which it isn't, and you see? Okay, so what happens in modernity is modernity begins to attribute to reason its own self-sufficiency, right? And in that sense, although it's very informing and synthesizing and so forth and so on, and constructive and active in that sense, you see, the passivity is that it will know nothing or little. I have to be careful depending on the thinker. It'll know nothing or little of any reality that is somehow or other outside of that construction, prior to that construction, independent in some sense of that construction, you see?
And so, you don't have to have that to know the world.
Fill in the, you don't have to have what to know the world?
You don't have to have...
you don't have to have the transcendent reality.
You don't have to have access to the transcendent reality.
That's right.
Or be that transcendent reality in order to have a scientific relationship
That's right.
with phenomenal world.
And that's the radical. That's the great thing about Kant. I mean, that's what he drove home over against, as I mentioned in the text, the doubts of Hume and the inadequacy. I mean, that there's already still a link from Kant's point of view, a lingering doubt in Descartes. I want to try and give us a kind of.
Well, this is helpful.
This is kind of. I'm saying, in a way, I'm kind of doing something like I think what you're looking for.
Exactly.
I had another thought, which I don't think is in this book, and I may allude to it in the book that we're not sure actually exists. But this might be helpful.
Potential.
It's
a potential book.
Yeah, potential book, a reputed book. But it's something, I don't know whether I was actually ever thought of it at this time or explicitly, although I guess it's all implicit. Everything is implicit. But certainly at a certain point it became very clear to me how important Thomas Aquinas's writing on the Eucharist is in the history of thought. It's so simple and it's just absolutely mind-blowing. I was thinking about it again this week because I was thinking a lot about Kant here. And now, you've heard, I'm sure everybody knows the term transubstantiation. Yeah? Okay. And Thomas Aquinas, when he's thinking of the Eucharist, right? So in other words, by faith, when the priest consecrates the bread and wine at Mass, what is understood to be going on, when I say understood, you have to be careful here, right? But what is believed to be going on is that the bread and wine are changed into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Now, for Thomas, this is literally what we believe, right? And so his term for that, because he was a scientist, you see, in his own world, is transubstantiation. The key idea being that the Eucharist is understood scientifically by Thomas to be a change in the substance of bread and wine into the substance of body and blood, right? Point being that you could have fooled me. It tastes like bread, smells like bread, tastes like wine, smells like wine. So Thomas says, well, what remains when the substance of the bread and wine are changed at the consecration is the appearances of bread and wine. See, I made an analogy for a different reason earlier in the course between Augustine and Descartes, as Augustine is to Descartes as Thomas is to Kant. Now here's a very concrete example of, it's not the only one, but this is central to Kant. If Kant didn't do anything else, what he did was he radically separated the phenomenon from the noumenon, right? And he said, all we know is the phenomenon. And that's all we need to know. See, Keats was a kind of Kantian. See, beauty is truth, truth is beauty, right? Well, what is that? Think about that. great line. Truth is beauty, beauty is truth. Translate Kantian. Truth is appearances. Appearances is truth. That's all we know in science, and that's all we need to know. That's all we know on Earth. That's all we need to know. Okay? See? All right. So we don't know the substance, the noumenal reality. And by the way, I don't know whether Kant was fully. Sometimes you say things and you think things, and you don't fully. You don't really intend all the implications of it. It's just there, so he calls the substance, the unknown substance, not only the unknown substance, by the way, because what's his name? Locke was also into a kind of unknown substance, right? But the key point in Kant is that in principle it's unknowable. He calls it noumenon. But noumenon is the Greek nous idea again, right? So in a certain sense, I just don't know whether he was very explicit about it, but in effect, it fits. In other words, what Aristotle understood as the world of nous, the world of knowledge in that perceptive, seeing, knowing kind of knowing, right? That transcended the thinking, rational process, specifically human kind of knowing. Well, in effect, Kant has said, well, we let that noumenal world, that world of the intellect in the classical sense of the word, that's beyond us, and we are dealing here now with the world of appearances, or the human, you see, meaning the rational animal, that is the reason as the form of a body, which implicitly or explicitly exists, therefore, in a temporal spatial realm.
Can I say
yeah.
something? This just might help. That word noumena is actually a grammatical form of a Greek verb that means to know, and it means the things that are known, as opposed to the phenomena, which is the passive parallel form of a Greek word that means to appear, to show forth, to manifest. So you have the things that appear. That's the omena part, and the things that are known. Now, the question is, does that use of noumena have any? Is there any usage before Kant, or does he bring that in? Because obviously, phenomena does have a.
Yeah, I just don't know the answer to that. Yeah. I just don't know. I mean, it's possible. I don't know. But I want to finish the Eucharistic thing with Thomas. So now Thomas got a problem, right? Because he's, he believes, but he's like Augustine. He's a thinker. He's a professional. This is his job, right? So, okay, we believe what you don't have to think about this to believe it. You can believe it. Right? You don't have to be a philosopher to go to heaven. Fine, but I am a philosopher, and so now my problem is, okay, I believe that. A minute ago this was substance, bread and wine. Now it's not. It's only appearance, bread and wine. But the appearances are still there. The appearances are still there, right? In other words, I need to know, if I'm a thinker, how is it, what's holding them up, right? Okay, now you understand Aristotle would say, what are you talking about? Okay, I mean, right? And by the way, of course, Aquinas agrees with him. It's very clear to Aquinas that the transubstantiation, the change of the substance of the appearances remaining, is got to be what? A miracle. It's a miracle, all right? So that solves that problem, right? But of course, assuming, it only solves the problem of the change of the substance. It doesn't explain how the appearances continue to, how are we to understand the remaining appearances? Now here's another more precise pre-Kantian move on Thomas's part. Thomas is a good Aristotelian in his own way, right? So he knows that, according to Aristotle, at least as it's normally understood, there are 10 categories: substance, quality, relation, accident, whatever. And now I say normally understood that way, but actually that's in one place, and in another place Aristotle lists maybe about 15. It's very sloppy. Aristotle was not a systematic thinker in the modern sense of the word. He doesn't pretend to be, doesn't care to be exactly, you see. So he's just doing his best as he goes along to enumerate the basic categories in which we understand being to be experienced. And obviously the primary one is substance. But sometimes substance means matter to Aristotle. Sometimes substance means form to Aristotle. Sometimes substance means the composite of form and matter. Just depends on what page you're on, what the context is, okay? All right. Nevertheless, substance is clear in Aristotle. That's where we start. Primary being, ousia, okay? And then there's quality and quantity and relation and so forth and so on. And Aristotle, as I say, doesn't draw up a neat list of them. It blows Kant's mind. He can't stand this. Okay? For Kant, this is disorder. So we need to, and we pointed out that what Descartes is into order. Now, Kant is not exactly Descartes, but it's the same passion, right? We've got to formalize this. We got to make this neat.
It's not just a personality
No, I understand.
thing. It is the very thing that is transmitted. It makes the progress, as it were, of science possible. Is the insistence on a consistency of terminology.
Okay. Fair enough. No, I don't think it's personal. I think, but it has to do with the personality of modernity.
No, it's why you're going from Descartes to Kant and not to 16 other guys who said nuts to that.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, good point. Okay. When he does this, he makes. Oh, I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to go back to Thomas and see the connection. All right. So now Thomas, before Kant, he's got a problem. How do I relate these appearances? Well, substance we've already taken care of. By a miracle, divine miracle, we got a different substance. But the same old appearances are still there. So how can I understand the appearances? Now, here's what Thomas does. This is the thing. Because he's got a kind of an Aristotelian mind. So he needs to have, he knows intuitively and otherwise, that for Aristotle, the substance was never disconnected from its appearances. And therefore, the appearances would be understood to inhere in, to depend upon the substance. Okay? So, but now I've removed the substance, and I have a substance that has nothing to do with these particular appearances, right? And so my Thomas's Aristotelian question is, what's holding these substances up, so to speak, metaphysically? Okay? And what he says is, he substitutes for substance a bedrock appearance. Now, here's the point I want to make. So he has to pick one of those non-substantial categories from Aristotle's sloppy list to make this. Now, this is, again, semantic play. So, to make, in effect, the substance, the apparent substance, or the substance, that which stands under the other appearances. What's the fundamental appearance going to be? What's the fundamental category of appearance going to be? And he decides, I don't think he spent any time thinking about this. I mean, you know what I mean? It wasn't a problem. It just came easy to him. Quantity. Quantity. Dimensive quantity, as he calls it.
Dimensive?
Quantitas dimensiva, dimensive quantity, which is what Descartes is talking about when he uses the term extensa. Dimensive quantity, as opposed to what? Multiplication quantity or additive quantity. You see? Dimensive, spatial, extended. So it's the category of quantity as extended. Extensive quantity, right? So that, says Thomas, is the bedrock of the world of appearance. He doesn't say it this way, you understand? But this is in effect what he's saying. That when I separate appearance from substance, what's going to be the fundamental category of appearance? Quantity. And then the other things, quality, relation, all those are going to depend upon and herein quantity as he says, as in a subject. As in a subject. All right. So when you turn to the Critique of Pure Reason, and you go to Kant's treatment of the categories, first of all, now I can go back to what I was starting to say. First of all, he said, well, he doesn't like this 10, 15, 13. How many categories are there? There have got to be 12. That's a nice, neat number. And it's 4 times 3. And then, so we have 4 basic categories, 4 main categories in Kant. Quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Right? Now, if you quantity, quality, relation, and modality, the fourth one, modality, is understood by Kant to apply to the first 3. right? In other words, it applies in each of the three areas, even though they're distinct from one another. Quantity, quality, and relation. All of them have modalities of being. Right?
Those are like logical modalities? Or what,
Yeah, as opposed to what, though? I mean...
possibility, necessity.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, right. Well, they have a logical... Yes, there are logical
Okay,
categories.
just what the word
Yeah, okay. And then within each of those four main categories, I'll just do quantity now because it's easy. Each of them has three subcategories, right? So the first is unity in the category of quantity. Second is plurality, and the third is totality. Right? And you can see what's going on there. You can see Hegel waiting in the wings. Hegel was very impatient about this, right? I have unity and I have plurality. Put them together, I have totality. A totality, something that is totalized, is many things brought into unity. That's the total. You see, you might say the sum total, right? Whereas I can have those many things untotalized, I just have a sheer plurality. And I could have just one thing that had no parts related to it. You see, that's the way he's thinking. And he does that in the other categories too. So just take the category of relation. In the category of relation, I have first substance. See, this is interesting. Where I'm combing through Kant's categories to find the primary category of Aristotle, which is substance, and I gotta do a sub-chapter. You follow? I got to go under relate, but it's so interesting. It looks like so boring stuff, right? Where is substance? It's under the category. It's hidden there under the category of relation. So you could say, in that sense, in modern consciousness, relation now is going to trump substance, right? Or what substance there is going to be subsumed by the category of relation. See? Now go back to Aristotle, right? My self-sufficiency. That little noose in me, that divine something or other, right, which I can't simply identify with, sorry, but nevertheless, it's there, and if I'm going to do anything with the rest of my life, according to Aristotle, I'm going to spend most of my time trying to be in tune with that, right, despite everything else, with all this ethics and all this scientific research and all this, all great stuff, but boy, given his druthers, Aristotle would like to be God, but not in a modern sense, without anxiety, he's not anxious about it. Okay, but he has that divine something in him, and he wants to be as much in tune with that as possible. See, but now what that means is, even ethically, I know I'm kind of jumping, but you want to get the spirit of this. See, you go to Aristotle's Ethics, which is where at the end he says, oh, by the way, it's more important the divine something or other in you it's your true self, it's what you really are, and much more important, if you had to make a forced choice, much more important than being content to be a human being. Okay. Or simply a human being. Earlier in the Ethics, he defines, not all the virtues, of course, and I think it's in the section he's talking about friendship. I'm not absolutely sure what section it's in, but it may be that one. And he's talking about, friendship is love for the other person. There are different kinds of friendship and so forth. And the idea is, the friend is somebody whose good is very high. Right? You love your friend. That means you want everything good for your friend. Right? But Aristotle makes the point that the good man who loves his good friend will nevertheless never love that good friend more than he loves himself. All right? Now, those of you who read Homer, the Iliad. See, Aristotle understood that Greek philosophy has its roots in Greek mythology. See, that is, he would understand that the poets were on the right track. They hadn't quite. And the famous poetic, mythological version of this deep Aristotelian truth, deep Greek truth, is the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Patroclus is his bosom buddy. He loves him like a brother. There's no one he loves more. And Achilles, this is coming from Achilles, this means a lot because Achilles doesn't love many people. I think it's him and Patroclus, you see, that's the idea. And Achilles won't fight the Trojans because he's ticked off at Agamemnon for dissing him, as we would say today. So he's withdrawn from the battle, and the Greeks are getting slaughtered. And Patroclus, who's a little more tender-hearted, comes to his buddy Achilles and says, "They need you. You just can't do this. You gotta help them, right?" He says, I understand. And Achilles says, "No, I can't. My heart won't let me. But if you want to put on my uniform, put on my armor and go out on the battlefield," because they don't have telescopes in those days, right? So when they see somebody coming from the Greek camp dressed up like Achilles, everybody's going to assume it's Achilles, and they'll all fall back. That'll give your buddies a relief. But I'm not going out there. But if you want to wear my armor, you go out there, right? Okay. So Patroclus puts on the armor, and Achilles says, "Now, wait a minute. Before you go, there are two things. Or there's one thing, two reasons. Don't, after they fall back, when they see you in my armor, they're going to fall back because they're going to think you're me. But two things you have to promise me. One is, no, I got it wrong. You have to promise me you're not going to pursue them. When they fall back, don't pursue them. Two reasons. One is, if you pursue them, you're liable to get killed. Because remember, implicit in the text, remember, you're really not me. Okay? So even though you're going to scare them off, don't pursue them once they retreat, because I don't want you to get killed. Why don't I want you to get killed? Because you're my bosom buddy. I love you. Okay? But there's another reason why I don't want you to pursue them. Just in case you don't get killed, I don't want you to get the glory. Okay? Now, see, and that, so now you say, well, what, is that egotism, Well, that's the way we'd normally read the Iliad. But Aristotle, you read Aristotle, you understand it's deeper than that. The good man loves his friend greatly, next to himself. A good man must love himself. Why? Because a good man is, at the core, is divine. A good man is at this core, is the most lovable thing. Do you see? It has nothing to do with any kind of rational egotism. Do you see? It has to do with the divine element in one. One cannot prefer the other to oneself ultimately in Aristotle. Do you see? And when you look at Christianity coming along, right? This whole world is completely turned inside out, upside down. You can't overstate it, right? In other words, the God who doesn't even know about the world's love, proper love of its being in Aristotle, that God all of a sudden now becomes intentional, worldly directed, both in the creative act and now in a saving act. God loves the world. This is Paul said this was offensive to the Jews and ridiculous to the Greeks. But actually, intellectually speaking, it would also be offensive to the Greeks. Intellectually, not religiously. It would be intellectually offensive, the notion that the divine would have any interest in, let alone for Aristotle, know anything about anything less than itself, ultimately. So if I was purely divine, what might appear to be self-love makes perfect sense. And for a man, a human being, to prefer himself ultimately to everyone else, including his closest beloved objects, all right, makes perfect sense because of the divinity in one's being. Now, in a created world where I'm no longer divine, that has been called into question. You see, and it's good timing, because if I'm no longer divine, then I've lost that proper ground for preferring myself ultimately to all others, and I've opened up the possibility that I may actually be called to put others before me. So that would be morally offensive to Aristotle. Right? Morally offensive to Aristotle. So Tacitus has a great comment about, for many, many reasons, a great comment about the Christians. Tacitus, the first century Roman historian, talking about Nero's persecution of the Christians, says that Nero, was really a bad guy for doing it, because he didn't do it for the public good. He did it for his own personal reasons. But says Tacitus, it's understandable because the Christians are haters of humanity, right? As the classical mind would have understood humanity, right? To have some kind of divine core. Right? Okay. So, I don't know how I get onto that particular point. Let's go into the text, unless you got questions? Okay.
You still didn't deliver the goods on transubstantiation.
Well, I think...
I mean, you started it. but
Okay,
you-
well, the point, okay, it was implicit, I think, okay. The goods that I intended to deliver, I guess, ultimate goods would be the connection with Kant, right? And so that,
Okay. well,
all right.
we can stop.
So, but let me try and deliver the goods. So, when you stop and think about that, in other words, Kant apparently didn't get away with this. There was no big uproar, right? Hegel's objection to Kant was not quite that. I mean, it wasn't. It's more complicated. We'll see in a moment, hopefully. But in other words, what I'm saying is that for Kant, it was a very serious thinker, to put it mildly. Okay? I mean, he didn't have any problem with separating the noumenal and the phenomenal, and saying that we know only the appearances and we don't know the substance. Because if I transpose that back into the Sunday Mass, that's what's going on in the Mass, according to the right. But here's the thing: in Kant, it's not going on in the Mass in a special consecrated moment, different from everything else in the Church. You see, in Kant, that separation between substance and appearance is not just happening to the bread and wine on the altar, so to speak. You see, but it's happened. The whole Church has been, don't take this literally, as if it were transubstantiated. It may not have been
the whole physical universe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the Church is, by the way. Always.
Oh, okay. No, but I mean, just in the
Right.
sense that in
Yeah.
the scientific world, which is emerging in Kant's time,
Yeah.
the idea that there are transformations that are taking place apart from appearance is what's happening all over the place. I mean, that becomes fully so in modern times, but in Kant's time, it's already beginning to be so.
Okay.
That something could be going on at the level of chemistry or at the level of physics that does not yield a change in appearance.
Well, okay.
I mean, I took that's what you
Well,
were getting.
no,
at
I think
in
it's.
your
I think
foundation.
that. I mean, there's an analogy there, but I think it's more fundamental than that. In other words, even when we're dealing with changes in chemical and other changes, atomic or subatomic or whatever, as it develops, those not obvious changes underneath this apparent continuity of the surface. That I don't. I think Kant's notion is much deeper than that. In other words, even those things. Well, the point.
The point was just that,
Yeah.
that the sense in which thinking about the Mass prepared the way for that kind of view of things.
Yes. Yeah.
That-
Yeah. Right. Oh, yes. And so I wanted to put a punchline on it. In other words, in that sense, the whole of modern science, in effect, depends upon a miraculous notion, right? That, you see what I'm saying? From a Thomistic or from an Aristotelian point of view, it's nonsense. From a Thomistic point of view, it would have to be some kind of a miracle to be able to effectively disjoin substance and appearance. That's what I'm saying, right? Okay, now I think we can go, hopefully, into the text. And since we're on Kant, let's start maybe around page 100, which is a little bit, maybe backing up a little bit or not. But,
Wait, before we go on, I know
Yeah.
this might be
Okay.
a big downer, but it seems to me that a similar split already exists in Plato's Cave in the Republic. That there's already a suggestion.
I like a downer like that. That's a good one. Yeah, go on.
That there is already the suggestion that our engagement with appearances might just be some shadowy false world, and that the reality is somewhere else. And I mean, it's different. In terms
What's the difference?
In terms of, it's like the reverse emphasis almost.
Well, but there's another difference. Think about it. What's Plato's project?
To find the true forms. Yeah.
There is a difference between appearance and substance, if you want, in Plato, but it doesn't go along with the notion. Quite the contrary, that I can't and shouldn't come to know the substantial reality. And in fact, in Plato, anticipating this divine core in Aristotle's psychology, but Aristotle's really specializing in the Platonic insight, I, from all eternity, know the substantial reality of the world, and I just forgot it when I was born.
Right.
Remember that? The doctrine of recollection in Plato.
Right.
You see? So yeah, the distinction between appearance and substance, if you want, or appearance and reality, again,
It's a
that's not new.
sociological-
That's not new. but it's the unavailability
Right.
to the mind of the substantial reality.
You'll
That's
never
what-
get out of the cave, Kant says.
Yeah, not only you can never get out of it, but hey, let's make it, as long as we're here,
Let's check out the
let's
cave.
make it comfortable.
Yeah, right.
Let's have, hey, I got an idea, let's air condition it.
Yeah, right, okay.
Try it out.
Yeah, right. Drain the swamps, let's, right?
So in other words, that's been all of mine.
Yeah, so there's another sense of the reconstruction of the world, right? The modern, not only in principle, not only in his mind, you see, but actually the reconstruction of the world growing out of this, taking the world as the ultimate limit of our intellectual ambitions, right? And then because we're doing this in a kind of reconstructive way in principle, it kind of follows from that we should reconstruct. How about a little artificial blood? How about some? You know what I'm saying? How about artificial limbs, and and on and on and on, right? So none of this. We're living in a very weird world from an Aristotelian point of view. I mean, really unbelievable. You talk about this is sci-fi in an Aristotelian universe. I mean, I think it's sci-fi in a way that it would never, probably not even so, because it would not have been even imagined, right? It would not even have been dreamed of, so to speak. Which reminds me of something Hamlet said, right? There are more things.
Hamlet to Horatio.
Oh, okay. Hamlet to Horatio.
Yeah.
There are more things than are dreamed of in
Heaven and
your
earth than
heaven and earth than dreamed of in your philosophy, right? So there we have the modern man speaking, right? Okay. And where are these more things? They're in heaven and earth. Page 100, about fourth line. Pure reason presupposes totality. The simple universal of Descartes' thought is, in light of the presupposition of the totality of experience, particularized. That is, particularity, which we're talking here about Kant, particularity, which is by virtue of Descartes' resolution to think himself pure universal humanity, excluded from the patient receptivity of scientific thought. Now there I'm using that patient receptivity of scientific thought so as to be merely implicit, is by virtue of Kant's irresolution, seen in fact among others, in the fact that, among others, that the noumena continue to hang in the sky out of reach of knowledge. Go back to the...
Resolution is
Yeah,
itself.
is itself universalized. That is, the particular qua particular is universalized. And I don't know whether I say it exactly here, but somewhere I may, and I want to make it explicit. And the way in which the particular is universalized in Kant is the medium is law. Right? In other words, lawfulness is the synthesis of the universal and the particular. And that anticipates Hegel. Right? In other words, and it also, by the way, in its own wrinkled way, creatively wrinkled way, it anticipates Peirce. All right, so in Peirce, that, and again, you have to be careful of the language here, because again, it depends on what page you're on in Peirce. But what I'm referring to here is that lawfulness as the synthesis of particular and universal in Kant is analogous to the role of logic in Hegel, logic which joins together subjectivity and nature, right? And in Peirce, the habit-taking tendency, right? That thirdness in Peirce, which unifies which in Peirce never is, the merely regular world of brute factuality, is joined by the habit-taking tendency which, if it were by itself, would be a sheer spontaneity. So the sheer predictability of spontaneity, of originality in Peirce, that's firstness, and the sheer regularity, the sheer inflexible rigidity, right? Sometimes mistaken for lawfulness, but never in America, okay? That sheer regularity, that brute factuality, that unchangeable thing, whether you like it or not, that's just the way it is, and nothing you can do about it. Those two things are married in Peirce's phenomenological categories by the habit-taking tendency. So actually, you have to keep in mind, they never fully exist independently of one another, right? The first and the second are parts, as it were, you have to be careful, of thirdness. Well, analogously in Kant, lawfulness, right, is that we don't and this is where, see, when Hegel read Kant, he was of two minds. He thought Kant was a genius. He thought it was really, I mean, Aristotle is unrivaled, okay? But after Aristotle, Kant is Hegel's man, all right? Because Kant, in those little boxes, those four big categories with the little 3 boxes inside of them, what Hegel saw in that is that Kant understood something that he didn't capitalize on. He understood that the one and the plural never do, in fact, exist apart from totality. That's the way Hegel would read Kant. Do you see? That spontaneity and regularity never do, in fact, this is Peirce's reading, right? Never do, in fact, exist apart from a habit-taking tendency, right? Apart from what, therefore, for Peirce is going to be a kind of evolutionary reality, right? And what makes the evolution go more or less forward, not without setbacks, but the tendency, what makes evolution go more or less forward is that thirdness, right? So already, in that sense of the word, Kant has created a synthesis, and in that way, perhaps he's overcome the dualism, in one sense, of Descartes. In other words, one way you could, I think, understand this is that Descartes, his famous dualism is, as I think I've already said, right? He had 2 substances there. He has a substance of body, res extensa, that substance which is characteristically, in Thomistic terms, dimensive quantity, and the res cogitans, which is immaterial, incorporeal, non-extended, not right, the soul in Descartes, and then they're wonderfully joined together, he knows not how, by a miracle, right? By God, in other words, right? Well, that's not satisfying to Peirce, and it's not satisfying to Kant either, right? I'm assuming something in my mind here. What I'm saying is, make the analogy between the universal and the particular. Descartes' universal human consciousness, embodied in the Meditations, embodied is the wrong word there, right? Instance in the Meditations. That's the universal element of Descartes. And the particular element are all the particular finite ideas that he has of things. Ideas meaning here not just thoughts, but feelings, visions,
So the
smell.
important thing is the universalization of this, the ego cogitans, the ego that's thinking, is not just his personal Descartes ego, but he takes himself as an example of humanity.
He
and
does.
That universalizes. That's what you mean by the universalization.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And then, since that's the basis of knowing objects in nature, they become universalized too. What ego?
No, I think it's not what he was saying.
Yeah, not quite. In other words, Descartes, the thinker, the ego there, is a universal human essence. Right? Any man can do what I did in the Meditations, is Descartes' attitude. But what he knows, the particulars that he knows, are all things that need to have their reality established by his consciousness. And he has different ways of doing that. The fundamental way, using the idea of God to support the reasonableness of his accepting all of these particular experiences that he has, right? So the question leads me to say, well, maybe we should be too hard on Descartes. He does have a synthesis of the universal and the particular, but I've just said what it is. In Descartes, the synthesis is the idea of God. In effect,
Isn't there another one too around this notion of extension? That extension is both the truest thing about the external world, but it's also the best language for describing it.
okay.
So it's sort of rigged so that the description of the world and the world will come together naturally. He says somewhere, I forget what it's in which point it is, where he says,
Right.
okay, we've got to have some language
Right.
for dealing with the description of the world. And the best language, the thing of all the things that we could go about describing, the thing that is best to describe would be quantitative.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So he's basically rigged it by saying that which is most true externally is extension, and that which is the best language for describing it subjectively is extension. And so they're blank.
Okay, but that, since you put it that way, the extension, though, in other words, remember the famous episode in the Meditations where he's talking about the melting wax?
Yeah.
All right, the wax changes its shape, its smell, its color, its feel, and so forth as it's melting in front of the fireplace, right? And he makes the judgment. Oh, and that reminds me of that question you asked me about the Aristotelian watch, okay? And I said, well, I just know this is a watch, right? Okay. And that was the correct answer I gave you. Right. But I thought to myself, that's a good opportunity to distinguish him from Descartes. Descartes doesn't just know that this is a watch. He makes the judgment that it's a watch. He makes the judgment that it's the same substance. Now, he's between Thomas and Kant, right? So for him, he's dealing with substance. And he makes the judgment that it's the same substance when he's dealing with that melting wax, right? He doesn't just know it, as it were, immediately. So his rationality is at work, right, in his judgment, that Descartes' judgment that this is a watch. Okay. Now, on the extension thing, the reason I thought of the wax is that, well, what happened? So now he's making the judgment, and then he's saying, Descartes is saying, he's prescinding from appearances when he makes that judgment, because if he was dependent upon appearances to know that, he'd have no way of knowing what it was. Okay, so he in his own way disconnects. But now I want to back up one step where I was trying to go. So in some sense, there's so many ways of slicing this bread, right? In some sense, extension is a kind of abstract idea. It's a kind of non-particular idea, which is what's happening when Descartes makes the judgment that this is wax, right? But it's changing and is in the process of changing all his appearance. He cannot depend upon his physical perception to know in any way that it's wax. So he makes that judgment despite the changing appearances. And so therefore you might say that his judgment corresponds to, and I'm not sure whether you were going here or not, his judgment corresponds now to an object which is in the judgment, is in some sense has been universalized, right? Yeah. Okay. But insofar, but he loses the particulars there. Yeah. That's the particularity. Okay. So what I thought of me on this was that Kant wants to rescue that particularity. He does rescue it in spades. Okay, in other words, he so rescues it that he makes the particular objects of our natural experience the proper objects of scientific knowledge, right? Well, how can he universalize the particular without melting it? To say, how can he universalize the particular without doing away with its particularity? And that's what I was trying to focus on. He needs a medium in which he can have the universal without sacrificing the particularities of the particular, and that medium is lawfulness. It's the laws of nature. The laws of nature. Okay.
Which are I'll save them. Go on.
Okay. So dropping down a little further on that page, maybe 12 or so lines into, still on page 100, the universal objectivity of science penetrates to bone's marrow. This man, qua time, qua space, is science's object. Right? I might also have said, by the way, it's the same thing. This man, qua space, qua time, is science's subject. Okay? So
now the words have begun to invert.
Yeah. Right. And so whether I'm dealing with the patient medically, who is the object of my science, or I'm talking about who is the scientist now is the flesh and blood doctor. That's the knower, the flesh and blood. And therefore, of course, appropriately, the proper object is going to be temporal spatial because the knower is understood to be temporal spatial. So now we've, in a certain sense, we've closed a circle. We've overcome, in that sense, we've overcome a kind of dualism. See, that's what's thought me on this. In Descartes, you could say he's a dualist because there's soul and body, or universal and particular, that I cannot have, as it were, Aristotle looked like this, in the same way at the same time, same respect, right? I can't. So there's a kind of contradiction between the particularity of the wax and the universal judgment in which it exists. And Kant's not happy with that, so he wants to overcome that contradiction with a third thing, the lawfulness, the natural laws. Okay. In order to do that, in order to get the particular and the universal synthesized, he has to lop off the noumena. You see? In order to do that, he has to leave something out of the picture, right, which is really inconsistent with a temporal spatial knower knowing, without leaving the cave, right, knowing a proper object. Right? So,
but the knowledge of the object is now a construction.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
Okay.
It's not the qualities of the wax prior to its melting. It's still the construction. Instead of a judgment, it's a construction that the wax is the same wax that now is soft and now is hard and now is hot and now it's cold and so on and so forth. But it's
Well,
not.
yeah.
But that which is known in that construction is not the noumenal wax.
Correct. But there is still a judgment, but it's not what Kant distinguishes the kind of judgment that is going to go on in science from what he calls an archetypical judgment or an archetype judgment, or an intellectus archetypus.
Yeah, that's what you're.
Right.
Prototypus instead of archetypus.
Yeah. In other words, what Kant see if I can.
That's the complexity aspect of Kant compared to the intuitive aspect of Descartes.
Right. Well, I call it, in this text, I speak of Descartes' rational intuition. And the only intuition in Kant, I say, is the sensuous or sensible intuition, right? And he denies that there is an intellectual intuition. That's it, okay? Now, this gets a little complicated. In Hegel, what we're going to have is an intuition that is going to be intellectual, because the language I use here is that in Hegel we're going to have an intuitive judgment, right? But it's going to be an intuitive judgment that, in Hegel's own way, is going to, and in that sense, you could say, in that sense, it in some way goes back to Descartes.
Well, he's got a sugar cube instead of a wax, but he basically does the same thing.
Well, it's not quite the same. In other words, in Descartes, I have a rational intuition, as I've just said, at the expense of the particularity of the rationally intuited object. And therefore I make a judgment about it, but the judgment, the Cartesian judgment, is not intuitive of the particular object. Whereas in Hegel, we're going to have an intuitive judgment which is intuiting the particular object, right? But it's going to be an intuitive judgment in the sense that it's like Descartes' rational. So we're going to have a rational, intuitive judgment in Hegel of particularity as such, or of the particular as such.
But this is as if reclaiming the union with the essence in the Aristotelian.
Yes, that's correct, because Hegel is going to understand in a way that is and is not similar to Plato, right? He's going to understand, or to Aristotle, really to neither of them. Hegel's going to understand that the essence appears. That's what he's going to do vis-a-vis Kant, right? In other words, the difference between the noumenal and the phenomenal in Kant, if we talk in terms of essence and existence, or essence and appearance, see, there's so many little things I should say. Existence in the modern sense, philosophically, is always almost always, referring to something in time and space. It's not so. To exist is a narrower concept than to be. Okay. So if you ask Peirce, does God exist? Peirce says, well, I don't know. If you mean, is God real? Oh, no doubt about it. Well, I couldn't say that. No practical doubt about it for Peirce. He has lots of good scientific evidence to understand that God is real, which is not the same thing as saying to Peirce, does God exist? All right. Now, so what I was saying is, so once you get into the modern world, existence becomes a big issue, as you can see in exponential and everywhere else, because that existence is implicitly or explicitly, it's this world of appearance existing. Right? So to a pedant, to a philosophical pedant, this is what Peirce was. If you say to a philosophical pedant, does God exist? He thinks you're asking him, is God walking around in time and space? Right? Or is he a temporal spatial type thing? Just say, and that's why Peirce hedges there. No, well, that's not the right question. Right? Say, okay. So essence and existence, noumenon and phenomenon, right? Substance and appearance. These would be the different ways of talking about basically the same kind of thing. And in Hegel, the essence must appear. It is in it's part of the dynamic, the process of the absolute self-realization of the divine, that the essence manifests itself, exists in time and space. Manifests itself in time and space, exists. Same thing, okay? So the essence must exist or appear. So backing into Kant, what Hegel understands the deficiency, one level of the deficiency of Kant, is that in Kant, this is what I was starting to go toward in pointing out to the dualism of body and soul in Descartes is overcome if soul means knower and body means thing in time and space. Descartes, those two things are two different substances, a kind of irreducible dualism there, even though they're miraculously joined together. In Kant, the soul part, the reason part, the knower part of that dualism, is now not dualistically separated from the particular sensuous object. They're not. Concept and sensuous intuition are united in a way analogous to form and matter in Aristotle, right? So our concepts for Kant are the formal ways in which we organize our sensible intuitions, right? And they don't, if there were no, well, see, in that sense, we have a kind of abstract modern return to Aristotle. I was trying to emphasize, Aristotle never is willing to separate actual matter and actual form. In other words, the way I put it was, where there's no form in the natural world, if there's no form, we're not going to find any matter, because we're never going to find form and matter actually separated. It's a contradiction in terms for Aristotle, right? So form presupposes matter, and essence presupposes form among natural things, okay? And Kant has that spirit, right? In other words, he's going to overcome the dualism of concept and sensuous intuition that's there in Descartes. He's going to unify them, right? But he's going to do an un-Aristotelian thing, which Hegel is going to bother Hegel, who thinks he's got the deepest understanding of Aristotle in the modern world. He's going to leave the noumenal reality over there, outside of this particular synthesis. So, to say, and Hegel is really champing at the bit when he sees that. That really is bothering him, right? Go back to the terms we were just using. He's leaving the essence out of existence in order to have a kind of unified existence as the field and the field of scientific endeavor. You see? But there's a noumenal substance that's beyond the reach of this realm of scientific endeavor, scientific knowing, this realm of time and space, this realm of existence, the realm of nature. Right? We can't get out of that. Now that doesn't. Why doesn't it bother Kant? I mean, should bother him. Well, it doesn't bother him because he solves the problem. But he's got to, actually, the irony is, since he prefers practical to theoretical reason, I don't mean that personally, but logically, right, that the priority is given to the practical nature, right, because the practical nature represents freedom. It represents as much as possible in the modern world the divine element in man, right? It doesn't bother him to have this particular dualism because in that dualism between the noumenal and the phenomenal, the dualism is compensated for by the fact that the practical reason is prior in dignity to the theoretical reason, and it's in the practical realm, even though it's not the realm of science, not the realm of knowledge in the strict sense of the word. That is the moral realm of my freedom as the author and the subject of the moral law of my own nature. So in the moral realm, I am in some way analogous, only you could say in a way more explicitly so than in Aristotle, right? In Aristotle, I know that I have this divine core and I have some fleeting sense of it, but it transcends my rationality. Transcending scientific rationality in Kant, however, is a moral freedom, an autonomy of the reason, which is, in classical terms, would be godlike, but for Kant, now of course, because he's consistent enough, right? In Kant, it's. I said in my answer to Chuck on the thing.
You have to look at them when you say Chuck, since I wasn't there.
That reason is Kant's God. And I think that's what I said. And reason is Kant's God. Kant's God, Kant's reason, is outside the purview of scientific endeavor. Thank God that's subordinated to the practical human sense of freedom, which is at least godlike. Do you see? It's that realm in which the idea of God has some meaning, some practical meaning, not a theoretical meaning, so much as a practical meaning for Kant. In that realm, all right, the idea of God, the immortality of the soul, all of these things that cannot be known substantially to be the case, nevertheless are aids in my, and this is where I go back to the Achilles Aristotle thing, aids in my obeying the moral law, which is obeying the law of my own nature. Okay? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, in the moral realm, as distinct from the scientific realm, I am in some sense analogously self-sufficient in Kant.
You need to distinguish this word practical in the Kantian context, certainly from the ordinary meaning of practical, which is distinguished in Kant between the moral and the prudential. Because certainly what's normally thought of as practical is, for the most part, what's the prudential.
Right.
So the practical isn't exactly the instrumental, the technological, the getting things done for practical purposes. It's precisely morality in his very particular sense.
Right.
Which, I mean, you could.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And the prudential or the expedient would also be excluded from the practical, right? Yeah. And the practical means here the practical reason. And one thing we haven't lost sight of, and this is also going to be objected to by Hegel. I feel bad about this. It's just very complicated. Okay, I mean, in other words, but once you get, you got to be. You just hang in there, and eventually you get the basic, you get the feel for it, right? So in Kant, talk about distinctions. He's a master of distinctions. His whole work is nothing but distinctions. Okay. In this moral realm, picking up on Chuck's point, this truly moral or truly practical or Kantian practical is a moral practical that is a rational thing, and therefore it is in its own way universal, not a particular. Okay? So I've said, well, in science he's kind of got them together, but there's a sense in which in the moral realm He doesn't have any particulars as his subject matter. And if you say, well, what is the moral law? What should I do? Be good to your mother. I mean, the Ten Commandments, for example, right? It's pretty relatively concrete. Obey your father and mother, honor your father and mother. Go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. Don't commit adultery. I mean, they're rather specific things, rather universally legislatable principle for doing it. Do you see? And if you so in that sense. You see, and this is going to bother Hegel a little bit, because now I've got to kind of disconnect a little bit there. This is kind of now, of course, this relates to my responsibility, my freedom, that I have to figure it out. I have the rule, right? But Hegel's objection is going to be that the rule has no particular content. It's a universal rule, and certainly will fit anything I happen to come across. I can apply the rule, but who's going to make this is very Aristotelian too. See, this is a give and take. It's a give and take. It's just a constant give and take. See, this is very good. Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle is not quite Kant, but in Aristotle's ethics, Aristotle doesn't tell you exactly what to do either. He just tells you this. You're going to be angry? Of course you're going to be angry. You have a body, you're physical, you're an animal. You're a rational animal, but you're an animal. So you're going to go, "Argh," right? Because that's what animals do. When you take their food, they go, "Argh," right? So the question is not that you're a disembodied angel. I mean, he's not a Platonist, right? You can't deal with this as like we shouldn't be here, right? So in an Aristotelian universe, my body and my soul go together inseparably. So I have animal feelings, and they're going to be good ones, positive things. So what's the rule then for Aristotle? The golden mean is sometimes called. Hitting the mark, not going to excess in either direction. So the question for Aristotle is, let's say, when it comes to the passion of anger, how angry should you be? Well, you should be not too angry, but don't be. Maybe you should be a little angry, not too much, right? In other words, if somebody comes up and hits you in the face for no reason or other, and you're not angry at all, Aristotle would say you probably should see a doctor. You've got a problem, all right? In other words, it's not natural, it's not normal, okay? So what is the appropriate, what is just the right amount? Well, how do you know that? Well, that you know because you're rational, you see? So Aristotle understood that reason informs passion in the case of the human being. It goes back to a question you were asking a week or so ago, right? In other words, what is the relationship between reason and humanity? Well, humanity, simply put, is rational animal. So reason is the distinguishing and informative and regulative aspect of that juncture of mind and body in Aristotle. Okay, so Aristotle in his own way doesn't tell you. So what Aristotle and Kant have in common is this. How then, in any concrete particular situation, is the right thing to be done? And who is to decide that? And the answer for both of them, in many different ways, is you're going to decide it. And when are you going to decide it? In that now, in which you're actually involved, right? In other words, yeah.
So reason, for let's say just Kant here.
Right.
Reason, if I'm going to make a dividing line between the noumenal and the phenomenal, reason's over there with the noumenal. Reason,
in one sense.
In one sense. Yeah. But here in the moral case, reason somehow jumps the line and informs a particular situation.
I don't know, well, in some sense, reason is I am rational. I have a rational nature, and from reason I get the rule. I get the moral law from my natural nature. In fact, I not only get it from, this is important in Kant, I give it to myself because I'm rational. Right? So you're talking about abstract thoughts at the beginning of the session. Thoughts is this is here. Okay? Rationality is not simply a thing in their understanding, right? So this is a certain nature, right? A certain ability, a certain way of being, which is rational, which has a certain, and therefore, you see, not as some separate thing, but therefore has a certain freedom. Reason gives me a certain freedom from my passions. In the case of Aristotle, right? I cannot simply act instinctively. There's a sense, in this sense of the word, human beings don't quite ever have simple instincts because if I use an Aristotelian way of thinking about things, where do my passions and my instincts where do they ever exist apart from my being rational? You see, so my rationality informs my physical being and the passions associated with it through and through, right? Analogously, in Kant, right, my freedom and my reason are not separate things. On the other hand, they're not simply, in other words, if I were to separate reason from freedom, then I would have nothing but the empty rule. I wouldn't be able to. My freedom is that which enables me to recognize the applicability of the rule and to follow the rule. Right? So the rule is, if you want, abstractly rational. It's the rule of reason, right? But it doesn't get me anywhere. I have to act. Right? And the acting is the level of freedom, responsibility, the application of the rule, and if I'm acting, and in this sense it's Aristotelian, you see, and if I'm acting, I can only be acting. I mean, here and now, in a concrete circumstance, right? So it's not a question of finding the middle course. See, he shifted it very differently, because what's the difference? It goes back to what we're saying about Descartes and the universal and the self-sufficiency of the Achilles Aristotelian. Right? Now, the principle is not me finding the appropriate way to act in this situation. Right? It is that, but there's more to it now. Now, it's not just the individual deciding that, which is true in Aristotle, but now deciding it on a universal principle, on a principle that could be, right? So, remember I said that when I look in the categories, in the Kantian categories, and there I find substance tucked in under relation. Do you see? So how shall I act? Is it simply me in isolation, metaphysical individuality? Do I have such a level of existence? Not quite, because my freedom, the guide for my freedom is not that, but it is something that I share with others. It's something by which I'm related to all others, and that's explicit in Kant. Right? In other words, in his formulation, that you could legislate this. When you legislate, that means you're telling other people what to do. But you can't tell other people what to do in Kant unless what you're telling them to do is what obliges you. So there's a certain kind of an equality there, right? But it's a universal equality, qua rational. I want to take a look at page 107. Maybe starting toward the bottom of 106, about 10 or 11 lines up. Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone, in which work ecclesiastical historical faith based on revelation, is displaced by what Kant calls the pure faith of reason, or I call a universal morality displaces grace. Okay. One way of simply understanding that whole book, which is a great book to read, Kant's Religion Within the Limits of Reason alone, is that translation, or it could be translated Religion Within the Limits of Pure Reason, is that one way of getting the essence of what Kant is doing is he's equating religion with morality, which is just a concrete way, a more or less concrete way of saying he's equating true religion with rationality. Right? So the practical is the moral, is the rational, and religion is true to the extent to which it falls within the limits of practical, rational, moral being. All right? And anything in religion which is outside of those limits is false for Kant. He has to be a little careful because they still had censors in Germany at the time. He was a good Protestant and he didn't want to get in trouble. Okay, so he's delicate, but he's conceptually clear. To give you the concrete example that you can find in the book at different places. He doesn't put the whole story together, but if you read the whole book and remember what he said earlier, what he deals with is the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain and he is prepared, apparently fully prepared, to slit his throat because God has told him to do so. And at the last minute, thank God, an angel appears and says, no, use the ram. And substitute the ram for Isaac. Well, what do you think Kant thinks about that? Kant thinks, well, he thinks that the whole thing is immoral. I mean, it's an abomination. Okay? Now, why is it so? Well, it's for a couple of reasons, by the way. The first reason is, the fundamental Kantian objection would be that you can, and this is the Aristotelian Achilles-like reflection in the modern consciousness, you cannot morally do anything simply because someone has told you to do it, even if that someone is God. Because the only thing you can do morally is what you do on this principle, the moral law, so act that the maximum of your action could be legislated universally. The only thing you do morally is what you do on that principle, which by definition is applicable to all rational beings. So that's your authority. It's not only your authority, it's the basis for your obligation to do anything morally. And if you don't act on that principle, you're immoral, right? And therefore, you can't say, "Well, he told me to." Why are you about to slit your son's throat? Well, because God told me to. Well, so what? Well, he's God. Well, so what? That's where Kant is at, right? Now, but he's got a problem. Because God's supposed to be good. Even Plato emphasized that. It was very important to Plato to say that the poets were wrong about Zeus and the women and all that jazz. I mean, the divine is just good, see? So Kant understands that. So he says, well, what was going on? Now, of course, he has a certain reverence for the Bible, culturally, right? And maybe personally. And intellectually, he has to take it seriously. So he says, well, what's going on? The angel, God speaks to Abraham, and he says, and by the way, in the text, it's really rubbing it in. Isaac, your son, whom you love. Right? We're not talking about this kid you're trying to get rid of, right? Okay, this is your son, whom you love. I want you to take him up and sacrifice him. You see? Okay, and Kierkegaard. This is an important story for Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling. So, how is he going to deal with this? This is great. There are two ways of understanding the story, says Kant. One possibility is that it wasn't really God. Okay? It was the devil pretending to lead Abraham astray. It wasn't because God. So understand, if God is good, God would not try and make Abraham do an immoral deed, right? So maybe it isn't God. That's one possibility, and Abraham was deceived by that. But then he says Kant, but maybe it was God. In which event, Abraham must have misunderstood him. Okay.
God is saved.
Yeah. There's no way, just say, that you can justify an immoral action. So morality becomes the measure of religion, right? Or the measure of true faith. Faith does not justify. Because what did Paul get out of that story? That Abraham was the man of faith, right? That's the way Paul read that story. And I think a more Jewish reading, I shouldn't say this, Paul would get mad at you, this is as Jewish as you can get, right? But a more traditional reading of Abraham might have been that Abraham was a man of obedience. Right. But they come, the form of Abraham's obedience was faith, and faith resulted in his obedience. But anyway, that's a subsidiary.
There's so many more tricks to the story than any of them get, really, because the whole story of Abraham is, from the beginning, is that he's promised a patrimony.
Oh, yes.
And he doesn't have a child until he's an old man.
Yeah.
And so the taking of it away is integral to the entire development of the story.
Oh, absolutely. And also it's contradictory to the promises he's been given by God and so forth and so on. But from a Kantian point of view, the key thing is that in doing what he did, he has no
authority.
He has no moral authority to do it. There's no reason for him doing, right? He has no reason to do this.
It's more important to time.
But you know what? There's even an element in the previous aspect of the story of Abraham where Abraham reasons with God. So
right.
the Kantian position is actually has text in the relationship between God and Abraham in the Sodom and Gomorrah story and various other places where he says, "Come on, God, let's get this right."
Right, and God is kind of condescending. He says, "All right, well, find me 50 men."
Yeah.
Abraham's not stupid. He says, "Well, how about 30?
10.
10? Well, eventually, it's not.
Yeah.
He works his way down to 10. what's interesting from the point of view of the New Testament, it doesn't occur to Abraham to say, what if I find one?
I know.
He doesn't say that. Okay. Well, we're going to get off on... but just to make that point, so morality, reason, the practical nature of man is the godlike, self-sufficient nature of man, so much so in Kant that even God can, as someone other than yourself, cannot properly command you, nor should you obey if you're intending to act morally. Something you just said made me think to emphasize something which may be clear, and I'm not sure it's clear. It's so the case in Kant that you need to have a reason for doing what you're doing, right? Is that if you stop and think about it, you must always have so. There's no relief from rationality in Kant, right? In other words, Kant is pretty heavy. He's heavy. So he has his moral equivalent of original sin. It's not original sin in a ecclesiastical faith-based way, but human nature is fallen because this is the requirement that we command ourselves to live by. This, everything that we do ought to be something.
And it's almost impossible to live by Kant's
Right.
rules. Everything is
Right.
prudence anyway.
That's
so-
right.
And is that, I mean, I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's in the book.
Is that flavor there?
Oh,
Kant
absolutely.
definitely
Yeah.
feels
Oh, yeah. It's got
it.
quite a bit to say about evil. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're okay.
Yeah, we are fallen, but we're not fallen in the mythological sense. We are
Right.
fallen insofar as we are at war with our own.
We can only exist
true-
within the structure that we
Right.
ourselves are.
Right. Well, it has to do with the sensible. You see, again, the scientific dualism is operating here in a moral context. In other words, the reason I need the props, as it were, of the moral support of the idea of God and the idea of an eternal reward and so forth and so on, is to shore up my natural, and I mean that literally, inclinations to screw up. Or disinclination to do the right thing might be a better way of putting it. You see? So, again, there's a certain war going on. That's why you can't oversimplify these things. There's a certain continuing war between reason and nature in Kant in the moral realm, analogous to the split scientifically between reason and nature in the scientific realm. Do you see that? Okay. Now, Hegel wants to overcome all of that, but let's try and get to Hegel a little further on. I wanted to just pursue this thought here. So of Descartes, back on page 106, about 7 lines up. Of Descartes, we have said that his free reason is an eclipse of grace, but since particularity is excluded from his simple universal medium, it remains an open question, dissembled by his method, what accommodation this man might make with God's will. But in Kant, where pure reason has become self-satisfying desire for perpetuity through humanity's infinite future possibility, then grace appears as an inadmissible contradiction to pure reason's moral self-determination. At that point, how thoroughly obscured is any question of an alteration of self-consciousness in history? Since even where facts of history relevant fall under consideration, it appears that they are inessential or related only by chance to reason's freedom. But if Thomas Aquinas is right in saying that Novitas Mundi, the newness of the world, this universe's novelty, is affirmed by faith alone, which is what Thomas says, by no demonstration to be known, then how could it be otherwise? How might reason more itself not be more oblivious? So in other words, what I'm saying here is there are many ways in which Thomas sets up the possibility of modernity. He's not a modern man exactly, but he's by no means simply a classical Aristotelian. And his faith supports certain notions in Thomas that if you bracket that faith, as Descartes does when he enters into his meditation, right, which notions are going to, without the support of faith, are going to have to be self-supporting in modernity, right? The history. So this is leading up to Hegel. So the reference to history here is historically what has happened as a matter of fact, going back to day one, the question of the incarnation, right? The particularity of if God was going to actually enter into time and space, in the nature of time and space, he had to enter in at some place and at some time, in particular, so to speak, right? Okay. So Kant doesn't Kant doesn't tackle the historical question. This is the larger point. He doesn't tackle the historical question head on. The point is that no matter what happens, as it were, objectively, or what might have happened objectively, or who this man, let's say Jesus of Nazareth might be objectively, given the radical subjectivity of Cartesian and Kantian consciousness, and especially morally so for Kant, is irrelevant. That is to say, there's no way in which I can know scientifically that this man is God, because God, by definition, is outside the ken of a scientific objectivity, you say, and it says I can't know that. The only way I can see any authority in this man is to see in this man what Kant calls the moral archetype of reason. Right? In other words, only in so. See, this is a concrete historical analogy to the idea that if there is true religion, it must exist within the limits of reason alone. If this man is truly God, let's assume, for the sake of argument, you say, if he is, for Kant, well, fine. As a practical matter, in the deepest sense of the word, right, the sheer factuality of that assertion is irrelevant. It's not decisive, let's put it that way. What is decisive is if I am able to see in this man, as I experience him in time and space with its scientific limitations, if I am able to see in that person reflected the archetype of moral goodness that I have in me by nature, right? So only to the extent to which the outer man corresponds to the interior ideal man, only to that extent am I obliged, as it were, to follow that man. But I'm not following that man qua irrational, faith-based belief, brute, sheer belief. I have a reason for following that, and when I say I have a reason, I don't mean I have a reason among others. I have that reason for following that man within my very being. Right? So in that sense, the window of faith and reason is completely closed, or faith and reason completely and simply coincide in Kant in such a way that whatever truths are asserted in the realm of faith are judged by reason to be, if they're judged to be true, are judged to be so because they're in conformity with what resonates as true in reason's own nature. Okay, so Kant will speak of faith, but Kant always means a moral faith. He doesn't mean whatever else faith might mean. All right. All right, we already, the pages I think that Chuck's question related to were the passivity and activity of reason are page 115 and 117, but I'm going to skip over it, at least directly, since we've already touched on it, and move to page 118. And again, in the Religion Within the Limits of Reason, just a little below the middle of page 118, for it, worship, ecclesiastical historical faith, which Kant identifies with ecclesiastical historical faith in his Religion Within the Limits of Reason alone, would be in cultus what knowledge of transcendent reality would be in sacred doctrine, or what epistemologically perception of an object's otherness would be, which is just an extension of this distinction I'm making between a passive knowing and an active knowing, a perfect contradiction of its resolution to be itself. Right? So the deepest resolution for reason in modernity and explicitly in Kant, carried, if possible, even further by Hegel, is that reason will be self-sufficient. In Kant, it needs to be more so than in Descartes. So going back to one of the original questions that when we started with, in terms of the kind of putting this in a historical framework, Kant's critique of Descartes in the Critique of Pure Reason is essentially as follows, and this relates to the, I don't know what question, I don't know if it was Chuck's question, somebody's question on the, I made reference to the Copernican, maybe in response to you in a way I brought it in. Kant understands his thinking to have affected a Copernican revolution in thought. Now, Copernicus' revolution in science was that from Aristotle to Copernicus, the accepted notion was that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Now, you understand the universe was very small compared to our universe. Our universe only started getting so big in the 20th century, okay? So the universe was very small. It was basically what you could see. And in the Aristotelian universe, the Earth was at the center. Pardon me. Yeah. The Earth was at the center, and the sun revolved around the Earth and the moon, and then the planets and the stars, the circle of the fixed stars, or the sphere of the fixed stars with the outermost arrangement. And then there were lower spheres. That's where the 55 prime movers come from. They're associated with various parts of this nested universe with the Earth at the center. And Copernicus had the interesting idea in the 15th century that things were getting a little out of hand in the Ptolemaic system, as it came to be known, right? Not that was not at all workable. It was, and they would draw these circles, and they would draw, when they saw one of the planets going the wrong way, they draw a little circle on the circle, and epicycles, and so forth. So that you could get a very complicated picture that would kind of explain what you actually were able to observe. And Copernicus said, well, I think there's a neater way of doing this, and the neater way, we just have to change our hypothesis. I don't know whether he would have used that term. We just have to change our assumption. Let's assume that the sun is at the center and the Earth is going around. And if we assume that, then we can draw pictures that are much simpler. And so Copernicus laid this out as a theoretical construct that would simplify the way they were looking at the universe in the last couple of thousand years. And this becomes a big controversy with Galileo, right? Because in this picture now, the Earth is moving, whereas in the previous picture, the Earth wasn't moving, everything else was moving. Now the Earth is moving around the sun and so forth and so on. That doesn't seem to conform with our everyday experience, right? It seems to me we're not moving, and I see the sun going across the sky and so on. So analogously, what's the point that Kant is making? He says, I've done the same thing as Copernicus did in thought. What is he talking about? He looks at Descartes and he sees Descartes on the right track, but flawed. What's the right track? Well, the right track is, subjectivity is the right track. The right track is that I've got to start from scratch. I've got to make no prior assumptions about what we were talking about earlier, the pre-existent, obvious, immediately known objectivity of the world of my experience. I have to call that all into doubt. Kant doesn't have any particular problem with that as such. His objection is that when Descartes does that, see how all these things come back together. Descartes does it by making the distinction between res cogitans and res extensi. So, put it in more simple terms, between his thinking, which is finite, and corporeal or spatial being. Right? Bodies are things that are extended in space, right? Or they're spatial. So Kant looks at this and he says, ha-ha, he didn't go far enough. There's something wrong with his methodology there. What he has done is he's made the mistake of thinking that, or let me start this way. Kant, in effect, is saying Descartes is correct when he thinks that his consciousness is somehow or other temporal, because Descartes makes the point to distinguish himself from the infinite being that his idea of God tells him is. He makes the point that he exists only from moment to moment. In other words, he can't account for his previous existence, and he can't account for being able to exist into the next moment. Therefore, God must be sustaining him from moment to moment. So Descartes obviously has no real doubt about his temporality as consciousness, which fits because he's abstracted this consciousness from time and space. But he's abstracted his consciousness, his self-consciousness, from his natural being, called the natural being into question, but only from Kant's point of view, as it were, half of it. In other words, he's called into question its extensiveness, its spatiality, its corporeality, but he has accepted uncritically its temporality, which he has included within his non-physical consciousness. Right? And Kant says, now Kant doesn't want to push the time out, he wants to bring the space in. He wants to say, as he ultimately says, that anything that we know is both spatial and temporal. And those are the forms of the transcendental imagination, time and space. They're the fundamental forms of a rational consciousness when it comes to apprehending sensible objects. Time and space are the fundamental forms of all sensible experience. All right? So from Kant's point of view, the fault in Descartes is that he's got space outside of himself, or the spatial world is something outside of his consciousness, and Kant has to get it inside. Okay? Now, why does Descartes have the spatial world outside of his consciousness when he should have it inside? What's the mistake he's making? What's the flaw? What's the problem in his procedure? The problem is that just as Aristotle and Ptolemy had it backwards when they thought that the Earth was at the center and the sun was going around it, whereas Copernicus has reversed that relationship, and he has the sun at the center with the Earth moving around it. Just as we reverse that particular relationship, so the mistake in Descartes is that he still has, despite everything that Leahy has said to the contrary, despite everything I've said about how different Descartes is from Aristotle, Kant is objecting he isn't different enough. He hasn't gone far enough. And what does he have in common with Aristotle? He doesn't say this, by the way, but this is what he's thinking. What does Descartes have in common with Aristotle? He has in common with Aristotle that there is some kind of thing out there that he needs to come to know, that he needs to build this bridge out from his consciousness through the idea of God, to get out, so to speak, to verify that there is actually something there, substantially, you see, corresponding to his experience of spatial being. And Kant says, hold it, you've got it backwards. It's not, here's the key analogy, it's not that the mind has to revolve around some independent reality of the world. You see? No. The reality of the world has to revolve around, accommodate itself to, appear in the fundamental forms of the mind's apprehension. Right? So does Descartes put the mind at the center? Yeah, but he's got something hanging out there. He's got that.
The Copernican revolution is really a Ptolemaic revolution.
How do you mean?
Well, because he's putting man back in the center.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Yeah. But yes, in some sense, that's correct. In some sense, that's very good because I like that. Because that might be a clue. We have the wrong book.
Thinking now occurring is the Copernican.
I'm not changing books.
No. But I'm just calling your attention to the fact that this issue that I'm about to lay on the table is more directly dealt with in Faith and Philosophy, if we can ever find it. Because I'm going to bring in Peirce here again. See,
yeah.
So, but this I like what you just said, because here we've got this apparent Copernican revolution, but not physically,
yeah.
but intellectually puts man back in the center, firmly in the center, right? Hegel's going to close the doors absolutely, right, to anything outside of it. Okay, so we're going to be absolutely in the center. And that's like the Earth. Here's the point I want to pick up on. That's like the Ptolemaic Earth that doesn't move. And that's exactly, although he doesn't say it quite in our metaphor now, this is exactly how we understand pragmatism. Because Peirce takes a look at this and he says, what do you mean it doesn't, the consciousness isn't moving? What do you mean it's immobile like the Earth? You Cartesians, you Kantians, I mean, like Kant, don't misunderstand me. You Hegelians, you make a mistake there. That center, that subliminal Ptolemaic center is too too immobile, right? That human consciousness is too immobile. So we need to get, says Peirce, an understanding, as I said many meetings ago, that the ideas evolve. The mind is not, and see, in other words, the American objection to what Descartes and Kant and Hegel are doing is that they have, in some important analogous sense that is behind Chuck's reversal idea, they have, in some new sense of the word, they have eternalized, they made static and immobile, do you see, the consciousness by putting it so simply at the center of things.
And by that you mean the categories like time and space or whatever it is.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So Peirce is going to say, yeah, right. There's nothing in Peirce, and so it's so interesting, you see, because he imagines scientifically now. This is Peirce, scientific, pragmatic, scientific understanding that it's only reasonable that there was a beginning of time. So now we're pulling the rug out of Thomas too. Because Thomas is still an Aristotelian enough to say, if you think there was a beginning of time, if you really mean that literally, that's fine. You're a good Catholic. But just understand, don't try and prove that. Don't try, or a better way of putting it, don't try and understand that. You see? Don't try and understand that. That's what Thomas says in the 13th century. He's in sync on that point with Aristotle. Or he believes what Aristotle was not worth believing. Okay? The Americans are really screwing things up. The Americans say, it's not only possible, it's entirely probable that there was a beginning of time.
But we need to put Kant's picture in here
Oh,
too,
right.
which is to say, absolutely you can't know. These are
Right.
absolutely fundamental impossibilities for thought to deal with. So he's right with Aquinas, only without faith. Without faith in the
absolutely. That's right. Absolutely right. But so responding to that remark, so one key thing to understand about Peirce is that the pragmatism as embodied in Peirce's creativity is the one thing it abhors. If there's anything that you can get all the American thinkers to agree on, they abhor the absolute. Right. Now, they don't completely abhor it because that would be absolutely abhorring the absolute, and they're not that inconsistent. Okay? You laugh. I'll tell you what the joke is. Not all of you are old enough to remember the original Saturday Night Live. I know some of us are.
We've got a lot of reruns now.
Okay. Well, there was a famous. Once they get a good joke, they usually beat it to death for a couple of months. And what's her name? The one who had the cancer.
Gilda Radner.
Gilda Radner. I think it was she who did this. Well, no, that wasn't. It wasn't necessarily her. But I'm sure she did it. But I think of her. There was a joke where somebody would say, one girl would say to another, "It's a lovely dress you have on." Not. Right? Remember that? Okay. Now that joke, which is funny, not when I do it, but it's funny. That joke is in William James. Only it's not a joke. William James made a very serious point that the great thing about Hegel was that Hegel knew, except that he absolutized the notion. Okay. If he hadn't absolutized it, he went off the deep end. But Hegel was on the right track, said James, who otherwise abhorred Hegel because of his absoluteness. But he granted him, he was good enough to grant him that minus the absolute, Hegel was really had a good understanding of our experiences, that there's nothing that doesn't have a not on the end of it, or at least potentially has a negative attached to it, including our lives, you may have noticed. Okay? So every affirmative can be denied, and that's Hegel took that and he ran with it. Okay, but if you don't run with it, then you say you cannot be an absolutist like Hegel, but we can't say you absolutely can't be. Now, depending on who you are, you'll parse that different ways. If you're James, you'll say, well, when push comes to shove, I prefer not being an absolutist. That's his cop out. Peirce, who's a little more theoretical, a little more logical, or not so personalistic as James is. Peirce's answer is much more interesting. Peirce says there is an absolute, except that we haven't yet arrived at it, and we never will. But that's not to say it isn't there. Right? So it's the goal. There is an absolute resolution of the world, and in that sense, Hegel is right, except that it's not back there. Right? It's out there, and the being in the middle. When I show you that what he does with the syllogism, right? We end in the middle. We end with particularity. We end with the minor premise in Peirce, and therefore what? We're always in the middle, and no matter how close, and there is a tendency toward the absolute ordering of the world. There is a tendency. The world is getting more and more orderly from a Peircean point of view, but there will never come a time beyond which there isn't a further step to be taken. That's the key thing. So we never actually arrive, but the absolute is not denied its place. It's very important. So American idealism is a kind of very interesting breaking and putting back together again of the Hegelian idealism. And the difference is that in American idealism, the ideal is our ideal. It's the ideal of having an ideal. It's not just simply having the ideal absolute, right? The absolute is our ideal. We're striving for an absolute realization.
Just quickly,
Yeah.
I now understand something about Peirce's view of the continuum problem.
Yes.
Which is that he votes for omega as the continuum, not any of the smaller olives.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
He's the only one that I know of that actually goes that way. Okay. Because that would be the one that you can't reach.
Right.
In other words, you can keep producing further and further infinites, but this is the inaccessible one.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's got to be that inaccessible, but it has to be there as the end post, as the goal post, so to speak.
Yeah. There's an abyss.
But the goal post keeps moving.
Moving, yeah. Well, ordinary infinity, the goal.
And the reason it moved, now I'm on this, it's got to be somewhat relevant here. I mean, profoundly relevant to Kant, because one way of understanding Peirce is that he managed to somehow or other synthesize Kant and Hegel, right?
Yeah, it sounds like Kant to me.
Yes.
I'm not that familiar with
That's right.
Sounds
This infinite future.
Sounds like an ahistorical Kant. That Kant would be ahistorical compared to Peirce,
Yes.
who has the Hegelian sense of historicity,
Right.
but the absolute as inaccessible like Kant.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So you save me the trouble of explaining it. Okay. Let's move to. Did I do that? Wait a minute. I landed there. I want to make sure I did what I wanted to do. Yeah. Well, basically, I did the free approval of reason, the passivity. We've really kind of already covered that. Let's move through to. Yeah, let's do 127 and 128, because that we've already alluded to, this intellectus archetypus on page 127, in the middle of the page. For Hegel, Kant's transcendental ideal, although the latter did not see it so, is real. Right? And quoting him in the History of Philosophy, the reason why that true idea should not be the truth is therefore that the empty abstractions of an understanding which keeps itself in the abstract universal and of a sensuous material of individuality standing in opposition to the same are presupposed as the truth. Kant no doubt expressly advances to the conception of an intuitive or perceiving understanding, which, while it gives universal laws, at the same time determines the particular, which we've really already said that that's Kant's advance over Descartes, right? And so Hegel is happy to acknowledge that, right? That's true. For to knowledge there also belongs intuitive perception, and the possession of a perfect spontaneity of intuition would be a faculty of knowledge specifically distinct from the sensuous and quite independent thereof, and therefore it would be understanding in the most universal sense. Consequently, it is possible to think of an intuitive understanding which does not pass from the universal to the particular. But that this intellectus archetypus is the true idea of the understanding is a thought which does not strike Kant. Let me just stop there because there are so many things I want to say about that. You go back to those Kantian tables and the four main categories: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. And modality somehow or other applies to the first three main categories. So you have a kind of three with a fourth comprehensive, and that's very important to understand Hegel, because Hegel's famous for his trinity. But there is a there's always a unifying fourthness there, so to speak, which is at least implicit in some ways explicit. In any event, in the tables of Kant, in other words, so all the trinities, all the threes, and then the fourthness, the modality in the first three categories, all of that's there in Kant, but it's really not as flat as it appeared to Hegel, right? Because he understands his genius, but nevertheless, relatively speaking, there's a flatness, there's an immobility to those categories, and this reminds me of where you started here, and I don't know whether this is what you had in mind or not, but the categories are the categories of understanding. So the distinction is between reason, right, Vernunft, and understanding, Verstand, right? And that becomes, that's a critical distinction in Kant, right? In other words, reason, the ideas of reason are never, when we say that the noumena are outside of scientific ken, they cannot be known objects, that's because the objects of reason, all right, they're objects of reason. Reason has these ideas of God, of a substantial soul, to say that that cannot be destroyed. So it has all these ideas, and they have a place, they have a very practical place in every sense of the word in the moral realm as supports for the weakness of my being. But in science, they have at best a very abstract and regulative guide. In other words, God in science is just kind of the embodiment, it's kind of the symbol, as Kant would says. It's the symbol of the transcendental unity of apperception. It's the symbol of the ego cogito. Because God is has only that symbolic value, meaning I don't have God as an object, but I have the idea of God which functions in terms of helping me organize my ideas, but none of my ideas are being infused with the synthetic objects of scientific knowledge, and those synthetic objects are always composed of concepts and sensuous intuition. And the concepts are the fundamental concepts, at least, are the categories of the understanding. So what Hegel is objecting to in Kant, one way of understanding it is that Kant can't get, another way of putting it in Hegelian terms, is he can't get beyond what for Hegel are the abstract thoughts of understanding. In other words, the understanding sees irreconcilable differences. The understanding, you can't understand, I cannot, here, now I don't know whether Hegel does, well, I guess in his own way he does do this. You could say, go back to the Eucharist. I believe it, but I don't understand how it's possible. Right? And that's seems like a very, I was going to say reasonable point of view, right? But strictly speaking, for Hegel, that's not reasonable. Right? That's understandable that that's understandable that you can't overcome the contradictions involved in changing substance, leaving the appearance. And so it's understandable that the noumena are beyond the ken of science, but it's not rational, says Hegel. Right? In other words, Kant sells human freedom short. See, just as Descartes sold short the idea. Oh, I never did finish that. Quick. How did Kant get space into the Cartesian temporal consciousness? He said Descartes has an idea that he's not permanent. He may or may not exist a moment from now. What says Kant to the now deceased Descartes? Don't you realize that permanent is a concept that you have abstracted from space? Right? In other words, time is change, and a pure space. Right? If I take my metaphysical vacuum cleaner and I suck all the time out of that chair, what are some of the practical consequences in the everyday sense of the word? What would happen? If I suck all the time out of the chair, this is a thought project. Metaphysical vacuum cleaner is now a temporal spatial object, right? I just take all the time out of it. Just suck it out. What would happen?
Falls apart.
Well, the idea is you
No, it's starting right now.
You would have just a static position in space.
Which would mean that I
There's no change.
couldn't move it. I couldn't.
Assuming
Not that it would fall apart, but it would be
three-dimensional.
indestructible because it takes time to fall apart. Okay, so you would have so pure space, unmixed with time in Kant. Pure space is the very idea of permanence. Therefore, for Descartes to say he's not sure whether it exists from moment to moment, Kant says, gotcha. You know damn well there's a space. You're not really in doubt about that spatial reality. Right? Space is, see? Okay, now, what made me think of that?
Kant sells human freedom short. As
Yeah.
Descartes.
Yeah. So now Hegel, see, he's doing a Kant to Kant, right? He's not saying. See, Descartes was right. We should center our scientific understanding in human consciousness. Kant, yeah, all right. Well, bring space in there, and then you got it locked up. But I've left the noumenon out. I left the noumenon out if I'm Kant, and Hegel doesn't like that. Get the noumenon in here.
What about the? I'm sorry.
That's all right. Go on. Go on.
It's 20 years since I did my own
Okay.
reading, but what I remember, probably the most vivid thing I remember, is the B deduction to the second edition, in which the transcendental argument for the synthetic unity of a perception is given, and a lot of it is based on this analysis of transitoriness and time, and that it's the.
Oh yeah, but I'm not saying. I think you're anticipating something I'm not about to say.
Oh,
Okay.
really?
I'm just making an analogy. I'm just making an analogy.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
The analogy is. No. I was not about to say that we don't have enough time in Kant, which I think is what you anticipate.
Well, no, that the whole motivation for the B deduction is partly in response to the Cartesian sense of doubt about how you get from one instant to the next, and how, in fact, how objects get to have identities over time.
Okay, but I'm not sure what the.
So it's not. I thought you were saying that it's simply space that gives those identities. I thought it was a lot more elaborate than that.
I think that's true.
Yeah. Okay. All right, sorry.
I think that's true. I think that's true.
Okay. One of the three things I remember about
Okay.
Kant, you just
Okay.
contradicted, so I was needed to bark.
Okay, I'm not sure I did, but I don't want to. I don't want to go off on that.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. What I wanted to say was that in Hegel, analogously, only on this one point, analogously to Kant's insistence that time and space have to be, space also has to be understood to be in that consciousness. Analogously, the noumenal reality, the rational reality in Kant, which is beyond knowing, you see, beyond science, for Hegel, that has to be brought in, as it were, to the realm of human knowing. Right? It cannot be left out there. And in that sense, reason has to be brought in. And I think, now that I'm onto this, I don't know, this is off the top of my head, and I'm not sure I might want to take this back, but I think there's another kind of Copernican-type reversal going on here, right? That when Hegel insists on bringing the noumenal inside the sphere of self-consciousness, right, which had been left outside of the sphere of self-consciousness as it was understood by Kant, when he brings it in, it becomes the driving motive again, right? In other words, it comes in, but it comes in as the center, right? So, in other words, for Kant, for Hegel, reason is understood. Why? All right. Okay. If you're catching little contradictions there, hold on to them. Reason is understood in Hegel to manifest itself in time and space. Reason is understood to manifest itself in existence. Reason is understood to manifest itself in history.
Yeah, you don't get history
Okay.
if you have the noumena that are outside of the realm of knowledge.
Okay. Now what? Now wait a minute. I just said that from Hegel's point of view, his problem is that he can't get beyond understanding. Right? And now I'm saying in Hegel, reason is understood. Right? So from Hegel's point of view, you have to juice up the categories of the understanding. You have to get those little trinities moving around on the page. You've got to understand that there's a dynamic process of interrelationship between the categories and between the sub-elements of those categories. So now watch. Now wait a minute. I thought that was the Americans who introduced motion into eternity. See? Well, yes and no. It's really hairy. Well, Hegel introduces motion into this still earth consciousness begun by Descartes and perfected, so to speak, within its own limits by Kant. Hegel insists that you've got to have motion there. Can't have right? But I don't know how to describe this. It's like, what he wants to point out is that, I'll solve it with an easy metaphor, it's not most satisfying. He wants to say, well, look at what's happening on the face of the earth. But he hasn't yet quite Hegel hasn't quite gotten to the notion, analogously, that the earth is moving, revolving, or moving in orbit. He hasn't gotten that far. But he's introduced motion. So how can we understand that conceptually? If you read Hegel, he will often he sometimes speaks of, I think he sometimes uses the evolution, but what he means by the term is really development. In that sense, he is faithful, after all of this, to Aristotle. In other words, yes, there is a kind of infinite dynamic of growth in Hegel. Okay? And in a certain sense, if you read the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is a great book, and I want to talk about unintelligible texts, okay? But when you read the Phenomenology of Spirit, when you get to that conclusion, if you get to the end, okay, the picture you should get is that there is an eternal recollection, there's a Platonic term, an eternal recollection of spirit upon itself, but not static like in Plato. Recollection means that in every stage of its unending infinite development, the spirit capitalizes on its previous stage, uses the third moment of the previous stage as the launching pad for a new movement. And that too will reach its conclusion, its syllogistic conclusion in a third step, in a synthetic step, which in turn will be the premise of a new syllogistic dynamic. You follow? And so you can go down and down and down and down. You're never going to come to the beginning of that, so to speak. And you can go on and up and up. So it's an infinite recollection upon itself, as it were, in both directions. Would you see? And so you got nothing but movement, it would seem, except that it's Heraclitus again. Okay? Except that this eternal motion itself has never come into being. You see? This eternally moving, self-realizing divine consciousness, realizing itself eternally in the forms of time and space and in history, all right? This itself, this totality, right, is not new. The totality is not new. The totality is not new. But
that explains the last sentence in the Hegel chapter.
Okay, why is that?
Which they didn't understand, which is that...
What page?
But on 133.
Okay.
But the Novitas Mundi, the novelty of this universe, is nowhere in sight. It has been swallowed up by the feeling of necessity.
Yeah. All right. So is there movement? Is there the way I do it in Faith and Philosophy? Hegel, in his logic, Hegel's he doesn't make a big point of this. Just going along, he's trying to get everything set out. So he comes to his next topic is becoming, and then under becoming, he considers the topic of beginning. And he says that beginning is a form of becoming. Right? Its beginning is a form of becoming with reference to what was or wasn't previously. Right? But the point being that he subsumes, the way I put it in the other book, he subsumes the beginning to becoming. Okay? But becoming itself, if I can put it this way, I'm now turning Hegel against himself. In effect, I'm saying, what Hegel does, he says, beginning is a form of becoming. But in effect, becoming has no beginning. Right? In other words, because beginning, as it were, logically comes after, is subsumed, right? Comes after becoming. There can't be a beginning to the becoming, and that's what this eternal movement. So is it dynamic? Right? It is, okay? But it's a dynamism which itself has no beginning. And in that sense, it's something like Heraclitus. And if you like Heidegger, it's because you're a crypto-Hegelian, right? In other words, the Heraclitean element, the lack of the beginning, right? The being, we were talking about the connection between, were we talking about that? Or something about Peirce and Heidegger? Some connection, somebody you knew? Or maybe
Oh, right.
yeah, okay. If you look if you read in Heidegger in the Contributions to Philosophy, which was published in the last 10 years or so, you get that sense, a kind of American sense, right, of a being in the middle between the first run of philosophy and what is yet to come, right, which he's in some sense waiting for, anticipating, to say, and that sense of being in the middle, okay, is very American, right? Okay. But to go back to the Hegel, I don't want to get off on that. All right. So yes, in Hegel there is movement in that now centralized consciousness. The center is internally in a perpetual motion. It's a perpetual motion machine, if you want to put it that way, in some sense. Not that it's going along on something else, because the whole point is that the Hegelian consciousness is the absolute consciousness of God. Right. So now God. All right. Let's go back to Descartes. In Descartes has an idea of God. And I pointed out to you that since the substance that the res cogitans is immaterial, Descartes makes the explicit point that although the idea of God is impressed upon him innately by the artificer, the God who made him, since he's an immaterial being, there's no reason why the image of the maker, the maker's mark, should be in one corner. How can you have a corner of an immaterial consciousness? You can't. So he says the image is, he doesn't use the word because it would have created a problem for him, but in effect he's saying it's coextensive, as it were. I mean, Kant would pick up on that. It's coextensive with his consciousness. He is the idea of God, and the idea of God is in him, right? So when you get to Hegel, but now God has been pushed, at least explicitly, to the periphery in Kant, both scientifically and morally, although I was trying to point out to you the analogy to the divine-like nature of the autonomous reason that will suffer no, which in its passivity, now this is the moral equivalent, which in its passivity will not suffer being told by another, even God, what it is obliged to do. It must determine for itself, absolutely in Kant, its own moral behavior and follow its own rule in doing so. Okay. So there is, in an implicit way, a kind of identification in various ways of reason with the free reason, the moral reason, with the divine, right? And then there's an explicit identification of the rational realm in science with the idea of God, but they are outside of scientific ken, scientific purview, all right? So in Hegel, if we're going to bring the noumenal in, and if the noumenal and the essential and the rational in being brought in are not only brought in, but come somehow or other to the fore, all right? Then the divine has to come to the fore. So that reason for Hegel, that logic in the large sense in which in today's text he identifies it with metaphysics. See, that's Hegel. What is metaphysics to Hegel? It's things held in thought. Okay? Logic identified with metaphysics is one way in which Hegel can be understood to be doing his version of the synthetic move. Things, thought. Appearances, the categories of the understanding. Things held in thought, things married to thought, right? That's the metaphysical realm in Hegel's usage, right? And what's missing there is the logos. What's missing there in Kantian terms would be the generating reason which has produced these things. That's the intellectus archetypus. That's the intellectual intuition that in effect is creative of all of the objects as thought is creative of the objects that appear in time and space, that accounts, as it were, for their origin, but does so eternally and as a manifestation of its own nature, as the means by which it realizes its own true self, you could say. That's nice. That's a good Aristotelian way of putting it. See? So God realizes his true self, contrary to Aristotle, by, well, okay, now we'll get into the Hegelian dialectic, which we probably should do. How? The first moment of the syllogism in Hegel would be the universal moment, right? And that would be the major premise. The second premise of the syllogism is the particular. All men are mortal, that's a universal statement. Socrates is a man, that's particular in a couple of ways, certain ambiguity of language. And then the conclusion, the synthesis of those two premises, Socrates is mortal. All right. So the first moment in the major Hegelian reason here means operative reason, syllogism, process of coming to a conclusion. So what's the first moment? It's the universal moment. Let's as it were, personalize it. The first moment is God, or the divine, or reason in its sheer universality, in its pure, in its infinite moment. No limitations, none whatsoever. The second moment, and this is handled by Hegel in myriad different ways depending on the context, but this is the form of it, so I'll use this one because it's big. God is the first moment. It's just God. Kind of like an Aristotelian God, in the sense that, at least if Aristotle's God had a subjectivity, if he was reflective, which he's not in Aristotle, but if he was, or if we would say, well, as far as Aristotle's God is concerned, there is nothing else. Right? Okay. Well, for Hegel, fine. The first moment is the pure, unlimited. Now, this is already a reversal of Aristotle, but in that respect, there's nothing but this. Imagine the first moment. But that's only one moment. That word in Hegel is important. It's a moment among moments in a process. Right? It's succeeded by a second moment. And how does Hegel conceive of the second major moment? This, let's say God in this case. In the second moment, God, or the first moment, divides itself from itself and stands over against itself. All right? So in other words, the second moment is a moment of opposition. The key, but that's not news. I've been being opposed all my life. I mean, opposition, but it's like James is not. See? The negative is not, I mean, if that's all Hegel did, I mean, what would be the big deal, right? That's not the point. I mean, that is part of the point, and that's what James liked. But what James probably didn't like, if he thought deeply about it, he intuitively knew he didn't like it, is that the really distinctive thing, which goes to the necessity issue, okay, is that the second moment, the moment of opposition, is a function not simply of a division within God, but it's, for Hegel, explicitly self-division. In other words, God, or the first moment, in this case God, doesn't have to be God, right, in any process, speaking absolutely, the divine being divides itself from itself and opposes itself in the form of the second moment, in the form of particularity, right? In some context, in the form of essence over against pure, unadulterated being. Do you see? Now, when it makes this, so what's the point of that? What's the point of that? Aristotle's God didn't need to do that and didn't do it. But the Hegelian God needs to do it if it's going to become aware of something. The reason I'm laughing is a little private joke. Right? In other words, Aristotle's God had nothing. There was nothing that he needed to be aware of, as it were. Right? But Hegel's God needs to be. What is something that Hegel's God needs to be aware of? Guess what? Hegel's a good Kantian in the same sense that Aristotle's a good Platonist. And what Hegel's God needs to be aware of is his freedom. He needs to be aware of the fact that he's free. Well, how do you become aware of the fact that you're free? Well, you don't really come to know you're free until somebody blocks you in a slammer. In other words, until you come up against limitation, opposition, You have no possibility of, the key word I'm using here is aware, conscious if you want. You say consciousness as opposed to mind in the Aristotelian sense. Right? To be conscious of one's freedom, you need to experience limitation. Well, so wait a minute, locking me up in jail hardly sounds like me becoming conscious of my freedom. But Hegel is more ruthless than that. Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, you're wrong about it. Think about it. If you weren't free, you wouldn't experience being in jail as a negative. You wouldn't experience being in jail. You wouldn't experience limitation. So the mere fact that you experience the negative as negative, you say, proves to you, it alerts you to the fact that you are not limited. Or Hegel might say, I said you is not limited. I didn't say that, but I want to say it now. You is not limited. Right? But the reason you is not limited is because you ought not to be limited. It's necessary that you not be limited because that's the way you is. So is and ought, the way things are on every level in Hegel and how they ought to be are identical. And now this is kind of, again, everybody has to have a paradox. I think it was it Kierkegaard who said that you can't, if a thinker doesn't have a paradox, he's no thinker. Okay, so one level of the paradox in Hegel, all right, is that for freedom, to be conscious of freedom is necessary, right? And you can see Sartre waiting in the wings, going to existentialize this, right? You cannot come to know your freedom unless you experience the negative, and it's necessary that you. All right, it's hard to say, right? And Hegel appreciated that. So that's why it's hard to read Hegel, right? But necessity and freedom are not simply alternatives in Hegel. That's the key idea. All right, so the second moment is the moment of self-opposition. The key word underlined, self-opposition, in which implicitly contains the leap, Kierkegaard didn't invent the leap. It's the leap over the walls. There's an old song that I used to hear when I was a kid. It was on the roller piano about these prison walls slide, my beloved. Right? So the yearning to be free presupposes your freedom, but you don't experience that as a conscious possession unless you experience the yearning, right? The need to overcome. So now for Hegel, to speak theologically, that second moment theologically is the world. God creates the world in Hegel. If he didn't create the world, he would have no chance of becoming aware of his own being. He creates that world as some being other than himself. And then he recognizes the moment of synthetic freedom, the overcoming of that Kantian dualism, reason and sensibility, noumena and phenomenon, God and nature, is when God realizes in Hegel that nature is nothing but this alienated form of himself. That nature has no truth of its own. The truth of nature or the truth of the other is just the occasion. It's just an ideal being in a very technical sense for Hegel, right? The world's being is ideal in the sense that it is there to be displaced. It is there to be sublated. It is there to be annulled. And I use the analogy in the appendix to Faith and Philosophy of I don't say hamburger, I use donut there, but you can use the analogy of hamburger, McDonald's, right? You go to McDonald's and they used to be, now they don't, everything, it used to be fast food, now it's kind of medium fast food. So they have to make it when you walk in the door, right? But they used to be, in the old days, the hamburger would be there on a heater. So you imagine a hamburger is there. What is that for Hegel? The hamburger is food. Now, if no one buys the hamburger, not only does McDonald's go out of business, but the hamburger is wasted. You see? So you would say, well, I'm going to eat the hamburger. You eat the hamburger, you say, oh, gee, you just destroyed the hamburger. Yeah, you destroyed the hamburger, but you did it a big favor. You enabled the hamburger to realize what it was, right? To realize its essence. Its essence was to be eaten, right? And the analogy, cosmic analogy, is that the world's essence, from a Hegelian point of view, is to be consumed by this divine being. And so God creates the world as the moment through the realization of the nothingness of which, God comes to realize that he, meaningless, it, the divine mind, is absolute, that there is nothing whatsoever ultimately outside of that divine mind.
So that's why there can be no newness of the no Novitas Mundi, because it's already it's just still part of it's all old in a sense.
Well, that's a good insight, because Hegel likes to emphasize what you don't see even mentioned probably in, well, it's there in Thomas, but it doesn't emphasize. But Hegel emphasizes the pastness of essence. Right, yeah. So that there is a pastness there. And you see this appearing again in Levinas. This is why Levinas, as original a thinker as he is, and as different as he is, nevertheless, you have an immemorial past. So this is absolute self-enclosure of the Hegelian self-consciousness. And in that sense, he perfects. But now he has incorporated history, the world of time and space, and not just political history, but the history of thought, the history of science. Everything now has found its proper truth as a manifestation of this eternal process of self-realization. I was talking about evolution before, and I was about to make the distinction, but I keep cutting myself off. It's development, not evolution in the Peircean sense, that there is a beginning, but it is an evolution in a much more narrow Aristotelian-like sense, that there is a movement from a less developed to a more developed state, right? And in a certain sense, this development is in some sense not outside of itself, but within itself. It's a kind of infinite in both directions. Would you say? But there's no possibility, just no possibility of its being frustrated. To say, whereas in Peirce, evolution in the full sense of the word is distinguished from development. And therefore, while the thirdness, the logic, is in the place of the divine logos in Hegel, the difference would be that Peirce understands it to be a habit-taking tendency, which will never actually arrive. See what I'm saying? So for Hegel, the actuality is the eternal process, and it's not at all in doubt. There's no possibility. Whereas possibilities, and I know what I want to say, and then I'll stop because I know I'm a couple minutes over. So the role here's the difference, practically speaking, humanly speaking, you might say. In Hegel, the ultimate embodiment of the divine idea on earth is the state, the nation state, keyword state. And at different times in history, because he takes history seriously, different states are the representatives of the divine idea on earth, so to speak. So it used to be England, and it was France and Spain, and one time it was Greece and Rome, and now it seems to be America, right?
And his time was Prussia.
Oh, Prussia, right? Yeah, good point. And and the Prussian state would be a kind of practical ideal for Hegel, right, of how the state might be organized. And so, humanly speaking, how do I get in tune? How do I realize myself now? Go back to Kant. So what is morality to Hegel? Well, in Kant, I have so act that everybody could be, every rational being could be obliged to use the same principle. I said, Hegel doesn't like it. It's too abstract. So all right, Hegel, give me your answer then. What's my rule? Well, Hegel would say, where are you from? Prussia? When in Prussia? Do what the Prussians do. You're an American? In other words, for Hegel, in any point in history, you have to determine what is the right thing to do concretely. And concretely is determined by your culture, and most particularly by the state, which is in the arbiter of justice of what is right. Okay, but broadly of the culture. So in other words, so in that sense, there's an absolute, but it's room. You see how he's just using this moral analogy. He's left room for a lot of particularity, but the particularity now has got its own universality built into it. In other words, I have to take seriously that this is 2003 and that I was born in America. And then I have a certain, you say, I can't, if I'm a good Hegelian, I can't prescind from that. I have to take that seriously. I just want to shout.
No, I was just thinking, so if I'm a Prussian or when I'm American, I have to do in accordance with the the values, or in a sense one could say that the state has an idea to live, the Hegelian idea of manifesting.
Well, in Hegel's mind, the state is the third moment. The family, civil society, business, education, all those things that we do, and then the state. And like in Aristotle, Hegel understands, even though he starts the book with this is on his, I'm going to block on the title, his book on politics, whatever he calls it. Philosophy of right. Start with the family, then you go to civil society, then you go to the state. But as in Aristotle, you start with matter, go as it were to form, then you go to essence. But that in Aristotle we say there's no matter without form, there's no form without essence, right? So Hegel has that same, and in this sense he's right to say he's an Aristotle. Right? For Hegel, the family, you start with it, we all start with it, and we logically kind of start with it, but it has no meaning apart from civil society. The meaning of the family is to create musicians and publishers and ex-publishers. That's what the family is, to teach you how to function in the level of particularity in society. And is your business, is your well-being, is your physical, emotional happiness the goal of what it means to be a free person? Hell no. It's your service to the state. And war is the reminder every once in a while that we're free. Because the ultimate limit is death. And war brings it up close. It's a tonic, it's a refreshment. If you're willing to sacrifice your life, then you realize, you see, that you are free. That's Hegel. Now, of course, it's a very un-American idea, but nevertheless, there's a logic, there's a very deep logic to that. Okay.
Hegel wouldn't have used the word, but isn't there some idea of manifest destiny?
Well, I guess you could, yeah, I don't think he would use that word, but yeah, in the sense that, yes, in the sense that each the state is working out its destiny in the context of the world spirit in history. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
I want to go back to something that you got me thinking.
Okay.
A point that is relevant to this in other ways. In Kant, I want to say the ecstasy of the noumena, the standing outside of what's knowable, in a sense is guaranteeing that what science is going to explore is subject to universal laws. Not that the universal laws actually capture the noumena, but that there's something outside of what the laws are able to capture,
that's right.
which remains invariant, we would say, in a later functional
right.
language. If you have reabsorbed the noumena into the known, you've done a bunch of different things. One of which is that you've made that world of an invariant reality that science does or doesn't succeed in capturing, itself subject to the historical circumstances under which it's investigated.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that sense, each culture or each state or each world has a different reality to which it's necessary for one to conform in order to be sane, normal, good, whatever. So it's the Kantian ethic that survives, in a sense, the Hegelian one into this postmodern world, and the very, very vital issue of a kind of rational morality that goes beyond the state, which Hegel refused to envision, right? He said there could never be a world government or anything of the sort.
Right.
But we're in a position in relationship with the multiplicity of nations today, which is sort of an analogous of the multiplicity of small societies trying to federate. And it's the Kantian faith that there could be some kind of absolute common ground for us to discover that is operative in spite of Hegel's supersession of the various Kantian positions, as is the question of the possibility that there is a constancy to the physical universe, which is there to discover beyond the various different epochs and fashions and conditions of scientific state of scientific theory.
But what about radical cultural relativity as part of the postmodern?
Well, I mean, it's a different question. All I'm saying is, to a certain extent, Hegel has got both the radical relativism. I mean, in that sense, that it's more nihilistic than Kant,
Right.
because there isn't anything sitting outside of what we've got, state by state, culture by culture, in the range both of a picture of reality and in the range of norms of behavior. So the relativism is there, in spite of the fact that Hegel has this monumental enclosing systematicity that has everything beforehand and captures everything.
Any other observations?
I need to do one thing quickly. I got 2 sets here of tapes. I succeeded in making 2 complete sets of the first 3 things, which anybody can have them.
Take one set.
Just, I don't know if it's a procedure who gets one set, $6 for
I'll
the
be
tape.
happy to share it. I'll be happy to share
Okay,
it.
can share with